The morning of December 8, 1941, broke cold and grey over Clark Field in the Philippine Islands. High above the jungle canopy, engines droned, a sound that carried through the humid air like distant thunder. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien stood outside a hangar, squinting into the pale sky. His hand shielded his eyes against the climbing sun, and for a moment he saw them. Dark specks growing larger, their silhouettes unmistakable. Zeros. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They came in fast, their radial engines screaming, diving through the thin morning clouds like falcons toward prey. Around him, the airfield erupted into chaos. Men shouted, ran for cover, scrambled toward parked aircraft. But O'Brien's eyes were locked on one particular target, a B-17 flying fortress sitting on the tarmac, her 4 engines silent, her belly heavy with fuel and bombs meant for a mission that would never come. The first Zero strafed the runway, tracers stitching lines of fire across concrete, then another and another. Within minutes, the airfield was ablaze. Aircraft crumpled under the assault, hangars collapsed in flame, and the sky itself seemed to burn. Yet amid the destruction, one thought hammered through O'Brien's mind. The fortress could take it. She had to. The Boeing B-17 flying fortress was born not of war, but of foresight. In 1934, when the world still believed in peace through treaties and the Great Depression gripped nations in its fist, Boeing Aircraft Company in Seattle began designing something audacious. A 4-engine heavy bomber capable of defending the American coastline from invasion fleets. The concept was radical. Most bombers of the era carried 2 engines and a handful of defensive machine guns. This machine would carry 4 Wright Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, and would bristle with weapons. The prototype, designated Model 299, first flew on July 28, 1935. When a Seattle news reporter saw it taxiing for the first time, its nose studded with gun ports, its fuselage gleaming in silver, he uttered words that would echo through history. "It's a flying fortress." The name stuck. By the time Japanese forces struck Pearl Harbor and the Philippines on December 7th and 8th, 1941, the B-17 existed in several variants. The earliest models, the B-17C and D, carried 6 50 caliber machine guns and 1 30 caliber nose gun, respectable but inadequate. The B-17E, entering service just as war erupted, was different. It mounted 9 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 8 heavy guns capable of spitting 750 rounds per minute, each round weighing over 1.5 ounces, each capable of punching through aluminum skin and engine blocks at ranges exceeding 3,000 feet. But even the E model had weaknesses. Its tail lacked adequate firepower. Its nose remained vulnerable to head-on attacks. German and Japanese pilots would learn to exploit these gaps. Yet what the fortress lacked in perfection, it made up for in one critical quality: toughness. The airframe was overbuilt, reinforced with armor plating around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent catastrophic fires, and a structural integrity that allowed it to absorb punishment no other bomber could survive. For the Japanese, the B-17 was an unknown quantity. Intelligence reports described it as a long-range heavy bomber, but numbers on paper conveyed nothing of its presence in the sky. Japanese fighter pilots, trained in the philosophy of speed and maneuverability, flew aircraft that embodied those values. The Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighter was a masterpiece of lightweight design. It could outturn any Allied fighter, climb to altitudes that left opponents gasping, and remain airborne for hours on missions that would ground other aircraft. The Zero's armament consisted of 2 7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, devastating in a dogfight, lethal against lightly armored targets. But the Zero achieved its brilliance through sacrifice. It had no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. A single, well-placed round could ignite its fuel and send it spiraling to earth in flames. Japanese doctrine, however, held that the best defense was to never be hit. Aggression, speed, and maneuverability would keep their pilots alive. Against the B-17, this philosophy would collide with a brutal reality. Captain Colin P. Kelly was 26 years old, a West Point graduate with sharp eyes and steady hands. On December 10, 1941, 3 days into the war, he climbed into the cockpit of his B-17C at Clark Field. The mission was reconnaissance and strike. Japanese transports had been spotted off the coast, and Kelly's fortress was one of 5 dispatched to find and destroy them. The crew ran through pre-flight checks. Engines roared to life one by one, propellers biting the air. The bomber lumbered down the runway, heavy with fuel and bombs, and lifted into the tropical sky. They flew for hours, scanning the ocean below. Then, through breaks in the cloud, they spotted it. A large warship, its wake cutting white lines across blue water. Kelly's bombardier called ranges, adjusted for altitude and wind. At 15,000 feet, the bombs released. The crew watched them fall, dark shapes tumbling toward the sea. Explosions erupted near the ship, near misses, damaging perhaps, but not a kill. Then the sky around them came alive. Zeros appeared from above and behind, diving with the sun at their backs. Cannon fire raked the fortress, shells punching through aluminum, severing hydraulic lines, shattering instruments. The waist gunners opened fire, their 50 calibers hammering back. Tracers crisscrossed the sky in brilliant arcs. One Zero broke off, smoke trailing from its engine. Another pressed the attack, closing from directly astern where the B-17C's defensive fire was weakest. Shells tore into the fortress's tail section. Flames erupted. Kelly fought the controls, the bomber shuddering under repeated impacts. He barked orders over the intercom. "Crew, prepare to bail out." The men moved quickly, snapping parachute harnesses, sliding toward the hatches. One by one, they jumped. Kelly held the aircraft steady, fighting the yoke as fire spread through the fuselage. The last man bailed out. Kelly reached for his own harness. But the fortress lurched, the controls went slack, and the bomber rolled into a final dive. It struck the jungle below in a fireball that could be seen for miles. Kelly's body was never recovered. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously, one of America's first aviation heroes of the war. For the Japanese pilots who witnessed the attack, the encounter left a lasting impression. One of them was Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, already an ace with kills in China. Years later, Sakai would write about that day. He described the B-17 as extraordinarily difficult to bring down. Even under sustained cannon fire from multiple Zeros, the bomber had continued flying, its guns still firing, its engines still roaring. Only when flames consumed the tail section did it finally fall. It was Sakai's first encounter with the flying fortress. It would not be his last, and with each subsequent meeting, his respect for the machine would deepen into something approaching dread. The early weeks of the Pacific War were catastrophic for American forces. At Pearl Harbor, most of the 12 B-17 seconds stationed at Hickam Field were destroyed on the ground. In the Philippines, Japanese attacks obliterated the majority of the bomber force within days. By the end of the first week, only 17 B-17 seconds remained operational in the entire Pacific theater. Those that survived were thrown into desperate, near-suicidal missions. Bombing Japanese convoys from high altitude, attacking air bases, attempting to slow an invasion that steamrolled forward with overwhelming force. The bombers flew without fighter escort. The distances were too great, the fighter aircraft too short-ranged. The fortresses climbed to altitude, formed loose defensive formations, and pressed into hostile skies alone. Japanese fighters swarmed them. Yet, even in those dark days, stories began to filter back. Stories of B-17 seconds returning to base riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, engines shot out, tail sections shredded, yet still flying. Crews climbed out shaken, bleeding, but alive. Mechanics stared at the damage in disbelief and set to work patching the machines back together. The Japanese, too, began to take notice. Initial reports dismissed the fortress as just another bomber, but pilots returning from engagement spoke differently. They described aircraft that absorbed cannon fire without falling, bombers that fought back with devastating firepower from multiple angles, machines that seemed almost impossible to kill. One Japanese commander at Rabaul scratched his head over reports coming in from the front lines. His Zero pilots, the best-trained aviators in the world. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. Were being cut to pieces by defensive guns. His flak batteries, effective against other aircraft, struggled to bring down the high-flying fortresses. He needed answers. He needed tactics. But most of all, he needed his pilots to survive long enough to learn. The problem was simple in concept, brutal in practice. The B-17 flew in tight defensive formations called combat boxes. Each bomber's guns covered the blind spots of its neighbors. Attacking from any angle meant flying into a storm of 50 caliber fire. A single fortress carried up to 13 machine guns depending on the variant. 8 guns could fire simultaneously in some arcs. A formation of 9 bombers could put over 100 guns into the sky. Japanese fighters, designed for dogfighting, were fragile by comparison. A burst from a 50 caliber gun could shred a Zero's wing, rupture its fuel tank, or kill the pilot instantly. The Zero's own 20mm cannons were deadly, but carried limited ammunition, 60 rounds per gun. A few seconds of firing, and the cannons fell silent. Against a formation of fortresses, those seconds were rarely enough. The Japanese adapted. They developed tactics, head-on attacks, diving from above, coordinated strikes from multiple angles. They aimed for engines, cockpits, the vulnerable nose section on early models. Sometimes it worked. A well-placed cannon shell could disable an engine or kill a pilot. But more often than not, the fortress kept flying. Saburo Sakai remembered one mission over Guadalcanal in August 1942. His unit had been tasked with intercepting American bombers. They found a formation of fortresses escorted by fighters. The Japanese pilots attacked, pressing through defensive fire. Sakai latched onto a bomber, closing from the side, his cannons roaring. He saw his rounds strike home, saw pieces of the bomber's wing tear away. Yet the fortress maintained formation, its guns still firing, its bomb bay still closed. He broke off, climbed, dove again, this time from the rear. His cannons hammered the tail section. The tail gunner's position exploded in fragments. But still, the bomber flew. Sakai's ammunition ran out. He pulled away, frustrated, watching as the formation continued toward its target. Later, he would learn that the bomber he attacked had made it back to base. The crew had landed with one engine dead, the tail gunner wounded, and over 200 holes in the fuselage. But they had landed. It was then that Sakai understood. The B-17 was not simply an aircraft. It was a statement, a declaration of industrial might and engineering philosophy that stood in stark contrast to everything Japanese aviation represented. Where the Zero sacrificed protection for performance, the fortress sacrificed nothing. It carried armor, firepower, and resilience in quantities that seemed almost wasteful. Yet, that excess was its strength. For Japanese pilots, the psychological toll was real. They had entered the war believing in their own invincibility. The Zero had swept aside all opposition in China, in the early Pacific battles, in the skies over Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. But the B-17 represented something they had not anticipated. An enemy that refused to die, an adversary that could absorb their best attacks and keep fighting. By mid-1942, Japanese commanders began referring to the B-17 with a grudging respect. Some called it the four-engine fighter for its defensive firepower. Others simply avoided engagements when possible, preferring to wait for the bomber's fighter escorts to leave before attacking. The fortress had earned its name, not through propaganda or exaggeration, but through the simple, brutal arithmetic of survival. And yet, the war in the Pacific was about to shift. The B-17's role would evolve. New variants would arrive with heavier armament, better defenses, improved tactics. The Japanese would develop new fighters, new weapons, new strategies. But the legend of the Flying Fortress was already written in the scorched aluminum of aircraft that should have fallen but did not, written in the memories of pilots who attacked them and lived to tell the tale, written in the quiet, unspoken knowledge that some machines, once built, could never be defeated by will alone. The B-17E model that entered service in late 1941 represented a quantum leap in bomber defense. Boeing engineers had listened to combat reports from Europe, where RAF Bomber Command and the early American bomber groups were learning hard lessons about the Luftwaffe's tactics. The B-17E's tail section was completely redesigned, stretching the fuselage by 6 feet to accommodate a proper tail gun position. 2 50-caliber Browning machine guns now pointed rearward, giving the bomber teeth where it had once been vulnerable, but the tail guns were only the beginning. The B-17E featured powered turrets, a revolution in aerial gunnery. The Sperry Ball turret, suspended beneath the fuselage like a glass and metal egg, housed 2 50-caliber guns and a gunner who crouched inside, rotating the entire sphere to track targets. The dorsal turret, mounted behind the cockpit, gave another 2 guns, 360 degrees of coverage above the aircraft. Waist gunners stood at open windows on either side, each manning a flexible 50-caliber mount. A radio operator's gun pointed upward through the fuselage roof. The total armament of a B-17E, 9 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. The G model, which would follow in 1943, would push that number to 13. Each gun weighed 64 pounds, stood 57 inches long, and fired 750 rounds per minute. The effective range was 3,500 feet. The ammunition came in several varieties. Tracer rounds tipped with red paint to mark the bullet's path. Incendiary rounds tipped with blue to set fuel tanks ablaze. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds tipped with silver to punch through engine blocks and cockpit armor, and plain armor-piercing rounds tipped with black for maximum penetration. A single 50-caliber round weighed 1.71 ounces. Its cartridge measured 5.47 inches long. When fired, the round left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, carrying enough kinetic energy to tear through aircraft aluminum like paper. A burst of 10 rounds could saw a fighter's wing in half. A sustained burst could disintegrate an attacking aircraft in mid-air. Japanese pilots learned this the hard way. Again and again, Lieutenant Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, one of Japan's most skilled aces, described an attack on a B-17 formation near New Guinea in early 1942. He and his wingman had climbed above the bombers, positioning themselves for a diving attack from the bomber's vulnerable high 6 o'clock position. The plan was textbook. Dive fast, fire a concentrated burst into the cockpit or engines, break away before the defensive guns could track them. They rolled into the dive. The fortresses grew larger in their gun sights. Nishizawa's finger tightened on the trigger. His 20mm cannons roared, shells arcing toward the lead bomber. Then the world erupted. Tracers streamed toward him from multiple directions. The ball turret gunner had spotted them. So had the tail gunner. And the top turret. 3 positions, 6 guns, all firing at once. Nishizawa's Zero shuddered as rounds struck his wings. He broke hard right, his wingman following. They dove away, engines screaming, trying to use speed and gravity to escape the cone of fire. Behind them, the bomber formation continued undisturbed. Nishizawa landed at Leh with 23 holes in his aircraft. His wingman had taken fewer hits but described the experience as flying into a wall of steel. The ball turret was particularly feared. Suspended below the bomber, it could track targets through nearly a full hemisphere. The gunner, cramped inside with his knees pulled to his chest, wore heated clothing against the -40-degree temperatures at altitude. His visibility was excellent. His field of fire was unobstructed. Japanese pilots approaching from below found themselves silhouetted against the bright ocean or jungle canopy, easy targets for a gunner looking down through his optical sight. One Japanese pilot, whose name was lost to history but whose account survived in unit records, described an attack on a lone B-17 limping home after a raid. The bomber flew low, one engine trailing smoke, clearly damaged. It seemed like easy prey. The pilot closed from below and behind, planning to finish the crippled giant with a quick burst. He never saw the ball turret rotate, never saw the twin barrels align. The first he knew of his mistake was when his canopy shattered and his instrument panel exploded in sparks. He bailed out over the jungle, his Zero spinning into the trees below. The B-17 continued on and landed safely at its base 2 hours later. The waist gunners, standing at open windows with the wind screaming past at 200 miles per hour, had the highest ammunition allocation of any position, 1,200 rounds per gun. The reason was simple. Fighters attacking from the beam, from the sides, were the most common threat. The waist gunners' fields of fire overlapped, creating a crossfire that could bracket an attacking fighter from multiple angles simultaneously. Japanese pilots quickly learned not to fly straight and level past a B-17's waist. Those who did often paid with their lives. The 50 caliber rounds, traveling nearly 3 times the speed of sound, gave little warning. One moment a Zero would be closing for an attack. The next, its wing would fold, or its engine would explode, or the pilot would slump forward, dead before his mind registered the impact. The nose of the B-17 remained problematic until the G model introduced the chin turret in late 1943. Early models relied on flexible handheld guns operated by the bombardier or navigator. These were awkward, limited in traverse, and vulnerable to jamming in the frigid high-altitude air. German pilots had exploited this weakness mercilessly over Europe, pioneering head-on attacks that the nose guns struggled to counter. In the Pacific, Japanese pilots adopted similar tactics, but there was a difference. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf Fullo 190 were heavily armoured, designed to survive hits from defensive fire. The Zero had no such protection. A head-on attack required nerves of steel and perfect timing. Close too soon, and the bomber's top turret or waist guns would shred you. Close too late, and your guns wouldn't have time to inflict damage before you had to break away to avoid collision. Some Japanese pilots managed it. Most did not survive to try a second time. By 1943, the arithmetic of air combat in the Pacific was shifting inexorably against Japan. The United States was producing aircraft at rates that defied comprehension. Factories in Seattle, Long Beach, and across the American Midwest ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. B-17 seconds rolled off assembly lines by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Between 1936 and 1945, over 12,700 B-17 seconds were built. The majority went to Europe, but significant numbers reached the Pacific. Japan, by contrast, struggled. Raw materials were scarce, factories were understaffed. Experienced workers were conscripted into the military. Production of the Zero peaked and then declined. Replacement aircraft arrived slowly, often with inferior materials. Engines that should have lasted hundreds of hours failed after dozens. Fuel quality deteriorated, causing Zeros to emit visible smoke trails that betrayed their positions, and sometimes erupted in bright flashes of flame from the exhaust ports during full throttle climbs. Worse still was the loss of pilots. Japan's pre-war training program had been rigorous to the point of brutality, producing small numbers of superbly skilled aviators, but the program could not scale. As veteran pilots died in combat, their replacements arrived with fewer hours, less training, and inferior skills. By mid-1943, some Japanese pilots were being sent into combat with barely 50 hours of flight time. They faced American bomber formations defended by hundreds of 50 caliber machine guns and, increasingly, escorted by American fighters that matched or exceeded the Zero's capabilities. The result was slaughter. At Rabaul, the major Japanese base in the Solomon Islands, commanders watched with growing alarm as their fighter squadrons bled away. Missions that should have resulted in bomber kills instead saw multiple Zeros shot down for every B-17 damaged. Pilots who survived described the experience as flying into a meat grinder. The fortresses were not simply difficult to destroy, they were killing the men sent to destroy them. Saburo Sakai, by then an instructor after his near-fatal wounding over Guadalcanal, spoke with young pilots before they deployed to Rabaul. He tried to prepare them, told them about the B-17's firepower, its toughness, the tactics that might give them a chance, but he could see it in their eyes. They did not truly understand. How could they? Until you had flown against a flying fortress, until you had watched your cannon shells strike home and do nothing, until you had felt the terror of defensive fire coming from every direction at once, you could not comprehend what you faced. Many of those young pilots never returned from their first mission. Their bodies were never recovered. Their Zeros vanished into the ocean or jungle, and the war ground on without pause. The veterans who survived carried a haunted knowledge, the knowledge that courage and skill could only compensate for so much, that the industrial might of America, translated into machines like the B-17, represented a form of warfare Japan could not match. The psychological impact of the B-17 on Japanese airmen cannot be overstated. In the early months of the war, Japanese pilots had felt invincible. They had swept aside all opposition, dominated every engagement, and seemed destined for total victory. The Zero's performance had fostered a sense of cultural and technical superiority, but the fortress shattered that illusion. Here was an American machine that did not fall apart under fire, that fought back with firepower exceeding anything Japanese bombers carried, that absorbed punishment and continued flying, its crews calm and professional, its formation unbroken. To attack a B-17 was to confront the reality that Japan's enemies possessed resources, technology, and determination that matched or exceeded their own. Some pilots broke under the strain, others adapted, developing tactics that minimized exposure to defensive fire. They learned to attack in coordinated waves, saturating the bomber's defenses. They learned to target specific aircraft, the stragglers and the damaged, rather than pressing frontal assaults against intact formations. They learned to use altitude, diving from 30,000 feet where the thin air gave them speed advantages and the bomber's engines struggled. But every lesson was paid for in blood. Every tactic refined through the deaths of pilots who tried and failed, and even the most successful tactics could only reduce casualties, not eliminate them. The B-17 remained a fortress, and fortresses do not fall easily. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in early March 1943 marked one of the B-17's greatest successes in the Pacific. A Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce New Guinea was caught by American and Australian aircraft, including squadrons of flying fortresses. The bombers attacked from medium altitude, using a technique called skip bombing that had been developed specifically for anti-shipping strikes. Instead of dropping from high altitude, the bombers descended to just above wave height and released their bombs horizontally, skipping them across the water like stones into the sides of ships. The technique was devastatingly effective. The convoy was annihilated. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned. The transports carrying them to the bottom of the Bismarck Sea were destroyed not by torpedoes or dive bombers, but by heavy bombers that conventional wisdom said could not hit moving targets. The B-17 seconds had proven adaptable, lethal, and far more versatile than anyone had anticipated. Japanese naval commanders watching from shore installations could do nothing but stare as the convoy burned. Fighter cover had been inadequate. The B-17 seconds had come in too low and too fast for anti-aircraft fire to track them. The ships, packed with troops and supplies, had no chance. In the post-battle assessment, Japanese officers struggled to explain how heavy bombers, supposedly useful only for high-altitude strikes on stationary targets, had destroyed a well-defended convoy in open water. The answer was simple but unpalatable. The Americans were innovating, they were learning, and they had machines tough enough to survive while they learned. By mid-1943, the B-17 was being gradually replaced in the Pacific by the B-24 Liberator, which had longer range and better suited the vast oceanic distances. But the fortress did not disappear. It transitioned to other roles. Air-sea rescue, dropping life rafts to downed air crews. Photo reconnaissance, using its high-altitude capability and defensive armament to penetrate deep into Japanese-held territory. transport duties, carrying supplies and personnel to forward bases, but its legacy was already cemented. Japanese pilots who had faced the B-17 inches its prime carried memories that time would not erase. They remembered the way sunlight glinted off the bomber's aluminum skin as it climbed into formation, the way its engines droned, a sound that could be heard from miles away, the way its guns flickered with muzzle flashes when it fought back. Most of all, they remembered the helplessness, the frustration of attacking again and again, spending ammunition, risking death, and watching the bombers continue on their mission as if nothing had happened. One Japanese pilot, interviewed decades after the war, described the B-17 as a symbol of everything Japan had underestimated about America. "We thought they were soft," he said. "We thought they could be broken. The fortress taught us otherwise. It showed us that Americans could build machines as tough as any samurai, and that they would send those machines against us in numbers we could never match." Another veteran, a wingman who had lost his squadron leader to B-17 defensive fire, spoke more bluntly. "We called it the four-engine fighter because that's what it was. Not a bomber. A fighter that happened to carry bombs. Every direction you attacked from, it could kill you. And if you succeeded in damaging it, another would take its place the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, until there were no more of us left to fight." The numbers bear out the truth of his words. Of the approximately 10,937 A6M0s produced during the war, the vast majority were destroyed. Losses to all causes, including B-17 defensive fire, combat with Allied fighters, operational accidents, and kamikaze missions, consumed Japan's fighter force faster than it could be replaced. By 1945, experienced Zero pilots were an endangered species. The green replacements who took their place had little hope against the waves of American aircraft that darkened the Pacific skies. The B-17, by contrast, remained in production until the war's end. Thousands survived to see peace. Many were scrapped in the immediate post-war years, melted down at desert boneyards like Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona, but some were preserved. Today, only a handful remain in flying condition, maintained by dedicated volunteers and aviation museums. These aircraft, veterans of a conflict that reshaped the world, still take to the skies occasionally, their engines roaring with the same deep-throated power that once carried them into battle. To see one fly is to understand something of what Japanese pilots faced, the sheer size of the machine, the way it moves through the air with ponderous grace. The sound of four Wright Cyclone engines in synchronization, a thunderous symphony that vibrates in your chest. And imagining that machine, and dozens like it, bristling with guns and climbing toward your homeland, it becomes easier to comprehend the fear and respect it inspired. For the men who flew the B-17, the experience was equally profound. Crews bonded in ways that transcended ordinary friendship. They shared cramped quarters at 30,000 feet, where the temperature dropped to 40 below zero and oxygen masks were the only thing keeping them conscious. They watched friends die in neighboring aircraft, watched fighters explode in mid-air, watched cities burn beneath them. They knew that statistically, their chances of completing a full tour of missions were slim, yet they continued, mission after mission. The B-17 became not just a tool of war, but a symbol of their resilience. When they returned to base, often with the aircraft shot full of holes, engines dead, hydraulics failing, they climbed out and immediately asked when she would be ready to fly again. The bond between crew and machine was forged in survival. The fortress kept them alive. They would keep flying her. One tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Thomas Riley, described his position as the loneliest place in the war. Separated from the rest of the crew by the length of the fuselage, crouched in a tiny compartment with nothing but thin aluminum between him and the enemy, he spent hours scanning the sky for fighters. When they came, he fought back with his twin. 50 calibers, the guns roaring so loud they drowned out all thought. He saw Zeros explode under his fire. He saw them peel away, trailing smoke. And he saw them press attacks even when it was clear they were dying, even when their aircraft was disintegrating around them, because they were that determined, that brave, that committed to stopping the bombers. After the war, Riley met a former Zero pilot at a veterans' reunion. They shook hands, exchanged stories. The Japanese pilot had flown against B-17 seconds over Rabaul. He showed Riley a scar on his arm from defensive fire, a .50 caliber round that had grazed him but not penetrated. They sat together for hours, two old men who had once tried to kill each other, now bound by the shared experience of survival and the mutual respect that combat forges between enemies. "I hated your airplane," the Japanese pilot said through a translator. "It took so many of my friends, but I respected it. I respected you. You were doing your duty, as I was doing mine. The machine you flew was magnificent, terrifying, but magnificent." Riley nodded. He understood. The B-17 had been many things: a weapon, a fortress, a lifeline. But most of all, it had been proof that engineering excellence, industrial capacity, and the courage of its crews could combine to create something greater than the sum of its parts, something that could change the course of a war. The summer of 1944 brought with it the beginning of the end for Japanese air power in the Pacific. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots would later call it, saw hundreds of Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single engagement. The Zero, once the undisputed master of Pacific skies, had become cannon fodder for newer American fighters like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair. These machines combined the firepower and ruggedness that had made the B-17 so formidable with performance that matched or exceeded the Zero's agility. But it was not just new fighters that doomed Japan's air forces. It was the cumulative effect of years of attrition, the loss of experienced pilots who could never be replaced, the degradation of training programs as fuel became scarce and instructors were sent to the front. The collapse of industrial capacity as American bombers, including B-17 seconds transitioning to bases closer to Japan, began systematically destroying factories, refineries, and transportation networks. The B-17 itself was evolving. The G model, which became the definitive variant, addressed nearly every weakness of earlier versions. The chin turret, mounted directly below the bombardier's position, eliminated the vulnerable nose that German and Japanese pilots had exploited. 2. .50 caliber guns in a remotely controlled turret could now engage fighters attacking head-on, the most dangerous approach for any bomber. The addition of cheek guns, flexible mounts on either side of the nose, gave the navigator weapons to supplement the bombardier's chin turret. In the waist, the staggered gun positions from earlier models were refined. Gunners no longer bumped into each other during combat. Each had a clear field of fire, and their positions were armoured to protect against fragments and light-caliber fire. The tail position was enlarged, improving the gunner's visibility and comfort during long missions. Every lesson learned in combat over Europe and the Pacific had been incorporated. The final tally: 13. .50 caliber machine guns, 2 in the chin turret, 2 cheek guns, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 waist guns, 1 radio room gun firing upward, 2 tail guns. With nearly 7,500 rounds of ammunition distributed across these positions, a B-17G could sustain defensive fire for extended periods. A single bomber could put out over 9,700 rounds per minute if all guns fired simultaneously. A formation of 12 bombers could fill the sky with over 116,000 rounds per minute. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. No fighter, no matter how maneuverable or well flown, could survive in that environment for long. Japanese pilots who pressed attacks against B-17 formations in the latter years of the war often lasted seconds. Their Zeros, still lacking armour and self-sealing tanks, disintegrated under concentrated fire. The lucky ones died instantly. The unlucky ones rode burning aircraft down, unable to bail out, screaming into radios that no one could help. One such pilot was Lieutenant Takeo Tanimizu, a 20-year-old who had graduated flight training in early 1944 with barely 50 hours in a Zero. His first combat mission was an intercept against B-17 seconds attacking a supply depot in New Guinea. He joined his squadron as they climbed to meet the bombers. His squadron leader, a veteran with 24 kills, briefed them quickly over the radio. Attack from high and behind, aim for the engines, fire short bursts to conserve ammunition, break away hard after one pass. Tanemizu listened, his hands slick with sweat inside his gloves. He could see the bombers now, silver shapes against white clouds, their formations tight and professional. His squadron dove. He followed his leader, trying to mimic every movement. Then the defensive fire began. Tracers arced upward, hundreds of them, crisscrossing like a spider's web. His leader's Zero flew into that web and exploded. Just exploded. One moment it was there, the next it was fragments tumbling through the sky. Tanemizu pulled up hard, his Zero shuddering, alarms screaming. He had been hit. How many times he could not tell. His canopy was cracked, his left wing had holes. Fuel was streaming from a punctured tank. He turned for home, hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the stick. Behind him, the bombers continued on, undamaged, unstoppable. He never flew another mission. His Zero was declared unserviceable, and no replacement aircraft was available. He spent the rest of the war as a mechanic, watching other pilots fly out and not return. After the war, Tanemizu wrote a memoir that was never published but survived in his family's possession. In it, he described the B-17 as a machine that embodied everything Japan lacked: resources, industrial capacity, the ability to build weapons so robust that they could absorb punishment and keep fighting. "We had courage," he wrote. "We had skill. We had the spirit of the samurai. But America had factories that never stopped, and they had machines like the Flying Fortress that turned our courage into meaninglessness. For Saburo Sakai, the end of the war brought a reckoning. He had survived, one of only 3 pilots from his original Tainan Air Group to do so. He had been shot down, wounded nearly to death, and returned to combat when Japan was desperate for anyone who could fly. He had seen the Zero go from invincible to obsolete. He had watched friends die, students die, strangers die, all for a cause that had been lost years before the surrender. In his memoir, Samurai, published in English in 1957, Sakai wrote extensively about his encounters with American aircraft. The chapter on the B-17 was among the longest and most detailed. He described the first time he saw one fall, shot down not by fighters, but by accumulated damage from a dozen attack runs. He described the frustration of expending all his ammunition and seeing the bomber continue as if nothing had happened. He described the day he realized that Japan would lose the war, and it was while watching a formation of fortresses fly over Rabaul at high altitude, unchallenged because no fighters had fuel to intercept them. "The B-17 taught me humility," Sakai wrote. "It taught me that machines could be as brave as men, if bravery is measured by the ability to endure. And it taught me that wars are not won by the skill of individual warriors, but by the strength of nations. America's strength was in her factories, and the Flying Fortress was the proof of that strength made manifest." Sakai lived until the year 2000. In his later years, he became a vocal advocate for peace and reconciliation. He visited the United States multiple times, meeting with American veterans who had flown against him. He spoke at schools and businesses in Japan, urging younger generations to remember the cost of war. His message was always the same: never again. Never give in to the madness that leads nations to destroy each other. At one reunion, Sakai met a former B-17 tail gunner named Harold Jones. Jones had been one of the gunners in the SBD Dauntless dive bombers that shot Sakai over Guadalcanal in 1942, nearly killing him. The two men shook hands. Sakai presented Jones with the flying helmet he had worn that day, still bearing the bullet holes from Jones's marksmanship. Jones gave Sakai a photograph of his crew, signed with messages of respect. They sat together, 2 old warriors, and talked about machines, about the Zero's grace and the Fortress's power, about the men who flew them and the men who fought them. Jones described what it was like to sit in the tail of a B-17, watching Zeros come in from astern, knowing that if his guns jammed or if he missed, his entire crew would die. Sakai described what it was like to attack a formation of fortresses, flying into fire so dense it seemed impossible to survive, knowing that even if he succeeded in downing one bomber, 10 more would take its place tomorrow. Jones said, both trying to survive, both believing in our cause. I don't know if we were right or wrong. I just know we did what we had to do. Sakai nodded. The machines we flew were tools of our nations. The Zero represented Japan's philosophy, speed, maneuverability, the belief that skill and spirit could overcome any obstacle. Your B-17 represented America's philosophy, strength, endurance, the belief that overwhelming force and industrial power would prevail. In the end, your philosophy won, but I do not think either philosophy was evil. They were simply different ways of waging war. The two men remained friends until Sakai's death. Jones attended his funeral in Japan, one of dozens of American veterans who came to pay respects to a former enemy who had become a symbol of reconciliation. The legacy of the B-17 Flying Fortress extends far beyond its combat record. It established principles of bomber design that persist to this day. Heavy defensive armament, redundant systems, armor protection for critical components and crew, the ability to sustain damage and continue the mission. Modern bombers like the B-52 Stratofortress, still in service more than 70 years after its first flight, owe their longevity to lessons learned from the B-17. The Fortress also demonstrated the importance of crew coordination and training. A B-17 crew was not simply 10 individuals in the same aircraft. They were a team where every member's survival depended on the others. The pilot and co-pilot flying in perfect synchronization, the navigator plotting courses that avoided the heaviest defenses, the bombardier executing precise bomb runs, the gunners watching every quadrant of sky, calling out threats, covering each other's blind spots, the radio operator maintaining contact with base and other aircraft, the engineer monitoring systems and troubleshooting malfunctions in flight. This emphasis on crew integration became standard across military aviation. The B-17 proved that a well-trained crew in a rugged aircraft could achieve results far beyond what individual skill or superior technology alone could deliver. For the Japanese, the B-17 represented a lesson they learned too late, the lesson that wars of attrition favor nations with deep industrial capacity and the ability to replace losses. Japan entered the war with some of the world's finest naval aviators and one of the best carrier-based fighters ever built. But they could not replace the pilots they lost. They could not scale up production to match American output. They could not adapt quickly enough to counter new tactics and technologies. The Zero remained in production until the war's end, with over 10,000 built. But by 1945, it was obsolete, outclassed by every frontline American fighter. Its lack of armor, once considered acceptable, had become a death sentence. Its light armament, once sufficient, could not damage rugged American aircraft before they killed the Zero pilot. The philosophy that created the Zero, the belief in maneuverability and range over protection and firepower, had been proven wrong by machines like the B-17. In the post-war years, Japanese aviation engineers studied American aircraft extensively. They examined captured B-17 seconds and other bombers. They interviewed pilots who had fought against them. The lessons learned influenced Japan's post-war aviation industry. When Japanese companies began building aircraft again, they emphasized ruggedness, reliability, and redundancy. The samurai philosophy of accepting death as a natural consequence of combat gave way to a more pragmatic approach. Survival became paramount. Today, only a handful of B-17 seconds remain airworthy. These aircraft, maintained at enormous expense by museums and private collectors, fly at air shows and commemorations. To watch one take off is to witness history. The engines cough, then roar. The propellers bite the air. The heavy bomber lumbers down the runway, seeming impossibly slow, impossibly heavy. Then, with a grace that defies its bulk, it lifts off. Climbing into the sky, it becomes what it always was, a fortress with wings. Those who flew the B-17 inches combat, the dwindling number of survivors, now in their 90s and hundreds, speak of it with a reverence usually reserved for people, not machines. They call it by name. My fort. Our girl. The old lady. They describe it as the reason they survived when so many others did not. They remember specific aircraft, specific missions, specific moments when the fortress took hits that should have been fatal but kept flying. One pilot, Colonel Robert Morgan, who flew the famous Memphis Belle through 25 missions over Europe, later said, "The B-17 was more than an airplane. It was a statement. It said that America could build something so tough, so well-armed, so capable that it could fly into the heart of enemy territory and come home. It said that we would not be intimidated. It said that we had the industrial might and the courage to win, no matter the cost." For the Japanese pilots who faced the flying fortress, the statement was received. Loud and clear, in every formation that flew over their bases, in every mission that succeeded despite their best efforts to stop it, in every loss they suffered trying to bring down the bombers. The B-17 was proof that the war was already lost, that Japan's strategic calculations had been fatally flawed from the beginning, that attacking a nation capable of building 12,000 heavy bombers while maintaining production of fighters, transports, and every other aircraft type simultaneously was suicide on a national scale. The simplicity of the B-17's effectiveness was its most damning quality. It was not a wonder weapon, it was not revolutionary technology. It was simply a very good bomber, built in enormous quantities, flown by well-trained crews, and supported by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. 8. 50 caliber machine guns, increased to 13 in later models, created interlocking fields of fire that turned the bomber into a flying fortress, in fact as well as name. Japanese pilots expected clever tactics. They expected superior technology. They expected American aircraft to be sophisticated but fragile, like their own prototypes. What they got instead was brute force, heavy guns, thick armor, engines that kept running with cylinders shot out, wings that stayed attached despite massive structural damage. And crew after crew, mission after mission, formation after formation, until the sky itself seemed full of fortresses, and there was nothing left to do but watch them pass overhead. The psychological impact of that realization, the understanding that no amount of courage or skill could change the outcome, broke men who had never faltered in combat. Japanese pilots who had faced death 100 times without flinching found themselves paralyzed by the futility of attacking bombers that would not die. Some refused to fly. Others flew but did not press their attacks. Still others embraced death, flying kamikaze missions in the war's final months, seeking an honorable end to a struggle that had become unbearable. In the end, the B-17 Flying Fortress was not the aircraft that won the Pacific War. That honor belongs to many machines and many men, but it was the aircraft that taught Japan a lesson it could not forget. That showed them the true nature of their enemy. That demonstrated, in the most visceral way possible, the futility of fighting a war of attrition against the United States. 50 caliber machine guns, later 13. Each gun capable of 750 rounds per minute. Each round capable of destroying a zero with a single well-placed hit. Multiply that by 12 bombers in a formation. Multiply that by dozens of formations flying every day, and you begin to understand what Japanese pilots faced. Not a challenge to be overcome through skill, not an obstacle to be bypassed through tactics, but an inevitable, grinding force that would not stop until the war was over. The Japanese never expected 50 caliber machine guns to turn B-17 seconds into flying fortresses. They expected bombers to be vulnerable, like their own. They expected American crews to be soft, unprepared for the brutality of aerial combat. They expected their Zeros, with their superior maneuverability and highly trained pilots, to dominate the sky. They were wrong on every count. The B-17 was not vulnerable. It was the toughest bomber of its era. American crews were not soft. They were professionals who trained harder and fought smarter as the war progressed. And the Zero's advantages, real as they were, meant nothing against an aircraft that could absorb damage and keep fighting, backed by an industrial machine that could replace every loss 10 times over. In the wreckage of Japanese air power, in the memories of pilots who survived, in the quiet acknowledgements of post-war historians, the truth endures. Simplicity, done well and in overwhelming quantity, defeated complexity every time. The Flying Fortress proved it. 8 guns, then 13. Heavy caliber, interlocking fire, and crews who refused to quit. That was the lesson Japan learned from the B-17. That was the lesson written in burning Zeros falling from Pacific skies. That was the legacy of a bomber that earned its name through the simplest and most brutal of proofs, by refusing to fall. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.